Hi, everyone. Welcome back to The Long View. I'm Julian Zelizer, and I am delighted to be joined by Danny Goldberg, who is the author of a terrific new book, Liberals with Attitude: The Rodney King Beating and the Fight for the Soul of Los Angeles, which is a new book. It's just out. Danny, welcome to The Long View.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
So maybe, I realize a lot of people, younger people watching, might not actually know what the Rodney King video was and what happened. Maybe you can just fill everyone in before we get started.
Sure. In March of 1991, a black man in Los Angeles was pulled aside by Los Angeles police officers and highway patrol officers for speeding after about an eight-mile chase. He had been drinking, and some sort of law enforcement apprehension might well have been appropriate. But what happened in this case was that four LAPD officers threw him to the ground, beat him brutally with metal batons while they were surrounded by 20 other LAPD officers. And it so happened that camcorders, which had just recently gone on the market at a price point where middle-class people could afford them. And there was a plumber named George Holliday who lived in an apartment building overlooking the area where King was beaten, and he videoed it. And that video, the Rodney King video, was later called by Al Sharpton the Jackie Robinson of police videos. It was the first time that white people had ever seen anything like that, and the first time that police brutality had ever been documented by a citizen. It also coincided with CNN having developed a major presence in the media. They had been covering the Gulf War for the previous couple of years, and the Gulf War had ended 3 days earlier, and they didn't have anything violent to show, and they showed the video dozens of times. And within a couple of weeks, there was a poll that showed over 70% of all Americans had seen the video because it was picked up by other networks as well, and 90% of people in Los Angeles. This precipitated a long conversation and political conflict in Los Angeles that I document in the book. It took about 16 months. And at that time, I was the chair of the ACLU Foundation of Southern California, and they had been involved for a long time with police brutality complaints in Los Angeles. And the police chief in Los Angeles at the time, and sort of the Trumpian villain of this book, was named Daryl Gates. He was immensely powerful because of the structure of the city charter in Los Angeles, because he had a team of policemen who gathered private information on city council members, and because he was a brilliant communicator and demagogue. And it was when the beating first happened, Gates, who was sophisticated politically, publicly said it was an aberration. But a week or two later, at a rally protesting that kind of brutality, Jesse Jackson spoke for many of us when he said it wasn't the beating that was an aberration, it was the video. So that's sort of the center of what I decided to write about in this new book.
And for those who don't know Daryl Gates, you really convey in the book how powerful he was in Los Angeles, the way he maintained his power over politicians. Can you just fill people in on that so they have a sense of his role in that era?
Yes. Well, there's two things worth mentioning about Gates. One is his power, and the other was his relationship with the Black and the Latino communities in Los Angeles. The power was due to, firstly, to a city charter that had been rewritten in the late 1930s that gave the LABT virtual autonomy in the city. The mayor of LA could not fire the police chief. It was literally, according to every political analyst, lawyer, and historian, impossible to fire the LA police chief. He also, as I say, was very media savvy. He was a Trumpian figure. Journalists who covered both him and Trump said there were enormous similarities in the way that he demonized his opponents, gave them nicknames, singled out reporters at press conferences and berated them in front of other people, etc. And although I hate when the term racist is thrown around loosely, there's really no other word for a lot of the way that Daryl Gates behaved publicly. The most notorious example had been many years before the Rodney King beating, when an LA Times reporter pointed out that 15 men in Los Angeles had been killed by police chokeholds over the last 5 years. That was at a time when no other police department in the country had killed more than 2 people by those chokeholds. But in LA, of the 15, 12 of them were black men, 80%, in a city that only had 18% black population. And the reporter asked Gates whether he thought there was any implicit racism on the force that resulted in that tremendous disparity. And Gates said, no, we're finding that the arteries in the necks of black men are different from those of normal people. And, after George Floyd was murdered, both Maxine Waters, who I spoke to for the book and who was involved in that struggle and is still in office today, said that it immediately reminded her of dealing with Daryl Gates. And so did Karen Bass, who was a who was a community activist in Los Angeles dealing with police issues in the early 90s, and who, of course, now is mayor of LA. So that comment of Gates was one of dozens over the 13 years he'd been in power that had infuriated and hurt the black and Mexican-American communities. But he had been impervious to political pressure up until the public revulsion at seeing the video. It changed the political dynamic enough that the struggle that I documented in the book was able to succeed.
And 2 areas where that public outrage manifests itself. One that you document is the Los Angeles Times, which is changing a lot as a newspaper. And 2 is rap music. Your full-time business is music, for those who don't know, managing artists. And you have a chapter on what kind of rap music was saying, not just about policing, generally about Gates. Can you talk about the role those 2 institutions played?
Yeah, in terms of rap, the early 90s was the moment when rap really became the dominant musical genre for young people. And I say that as someone who was managing Nirvana in 1991. But Nirvana was really the last big rock group that was also a pop phenomenon. And although rap had been around for several years, the LA rappers took it even to another level. And the LA artist that broke open the doors for that kind of rap was called NWA, N blank with attitude. And their most famous song was called "Fuck the Police," which was not about police in general. It was about the Los Angeles Police Department in particular. And in fact, Daryl Gates was name checked in more than 15 rap lyrics. Now, what difference did that make? One difference it made is that white kids were listening to rap music, not just black kids. And so they were learning what people who watched CNN were learning when they saw the Rodney King video. Those millions of white kids who listened to rap were learning how their black counterparts felt about the Los Angeles Police Department. And it was part of the awakening of the white community. On a parallel track, and speaking to a different demographic, the Los Angeles Times played an important role in this struggle. They documented the fights between the mayor of Los Angeles, who I'll talk about in a minute, and Gates almost on a daily basis. They wrote over 50 editorials, and they had changed, as you suggested, earlier in the 20th century. When they started in the early 1900s, I think it was, might be the late 1800s, the LA Times was a conservative newspaper. They were anti-union, and they later on were tremendous supporters of and really put Richard Nixon on the map. They helped put Ronald Reagan on the map as a national figure. And they had always supported the Los Angeles Police Department in the past when they were accused of racism. But at some point in the late 80s, the fourth generation of the family that owned the LA Times, the Chandler family, became the publisher. His name was Otis Chandler. He was then in his late 30s. He had worked his way up to, they'd had him take every different job in the newspaper, so he was prepared to be the publisher. And he was a liberal. He had been a friend of Robert Kennedy's, whose presidential campaign he had supported. And he dramatically changed the editorial posture of the paper and hired a man named Shelby Coffey, who had been at the Washington Post during Watergate. And there were dozens of other LA Times reporters and editors who became pretty vocal in their revulsion and opposition to what they perceived as a pattern of racism and brutality on the police force. And although I feel most accusations of or depictions of the so-called liberal media are either delusional or intentionally confusing and inaccurate, there's no question that in LA at that time, the LA Times was kind of part of the coalition that included the ACLU, that included the Black community, and that was really led by Mayor Tom Bradley.
So let's talk about that, because at the heart of the book is something of a question. The video is shocking, it's dramatic, but sometimes these videos then don't lead to reform. Yours is a story that does. You have the mayor, Congresswoman Waters, and you also have this coalition that you were part of with the ACLU. So how did that coalition work and sustain political pressure to actually do something about the video as opposed to just letting it fade?
Well, Mayor Bradley, Tom Bradley, was an interesting historical figure. I think has been a little underappreciated uh, so far by historians. He was the first Black mayor of Los Angeles and one of the first Black mayors in the United States. And the other American cities that had Black mayors in starting in the 1970s, Cleveland and Newark, both had a Black population of close to 40%. The Black population in LA was only 18%. So from the beginning, Tom Bradley needed to have a multiracial coalition, and that was part of his genius, was as a coalition builder. His Andrew Young later said that Bradley's campaigns foreshadowed Barack Obama's campaigns in terms of the way that they were able to activate the Black community, but still reach out to and motivate enough white people for him to win. And Bradley had started his career as a Los Angeles Police Department officer. And he and Daryl Gates had known each other for 40 years and hated each other for 40 years. Bradley rose to the level of lieutenant, which as far as a Black man could go in those days. When Bradley was on the force, they didn't even let Black and white officers share a police car. And he then ran for the city council and then later became mayor. He was a risk-averse politician, Tom Bradley was. He was a centrist. He supported Walter Mondale for president when Maxine Waters supported Jesse Jackson. He was very close to the business community. The airport in LA is called the Tom Bradley Airport because he presided over its construction. And although he had been well aware of the racist patterns of behavior on some people in the LAPD and which encouraged by their chief, he had not wanted to fully confront him up until he saw the Rodney King video. By that time, Bradley was in his fifth term. He knew it was going to be his last term. He was 74, and he knew that his legacy depended on finally doing something about this. Members of the Black community had criticized him for some time for not confronting Gates, but Bradley never felt he had the political capital. No change could take place in LA without the city council's support. And the city council included members that were in mostly white districts. It included members who Gates had the dirt on, who could intimidate. And in any situation, politicians are wary of alienating police chiefs because citizens are scared of crime, including Black citizens. But the video was a game changer. And Bradley's background and sophistication with both the mechanics of city government and with the demographics of the city allowed him to put together a coalition that was ultimately successful. It took 16 months. And the city charter was amended by a ballot initiative so that the department had the same kind of accountability to the rest of city government that police departments do in other cities, and Gates was forced to resign. The coalition included some other characters in the book. May I talk about them?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. One of them was my mentor, a man named Stanley Scheinbaum, who had been chair of the ACLU before I was, and it was his idea. Stanley was a wealthy philanthropist and known as a liberal philanthropist. He was to the left of Norman Lear, his best friend. Stanley had done the first fundraiser outside of Vermont for Bernie Sanders when he first ran for mayor of Burlington, for example. It's close to Jesse Jackson and Maxine Waters. And Bradley appointed Stanley to be the president of the Los Angeles Police Commission, a fairly weak body, but they had oversight over some of the budgeting issues and some of the processes of the LAPD, and the chief was forced to meet with them once a week. So Scheinbaum from the inside was constantly pressuring Gates, trying to make him hate his job more than he loved it, trying to keep the left and the black and the civil liberties community motivated because, like you said, these videos come and go, but crime is 365 days a year. At the same week that he appointed Scheinbaum, he made another appointment, Warren Christopher, who was politically a centrist corporate Democrat. He was one of the most powerful corporate lawyers in Los Angeles, managing partner of a firm called Melvin and Myers, which is still one of the biggest law firms there. And Christopher was very tightly connected to mainstream Democratic politics. He would be named Secretary of State by Bill Clinton in January of '93. And Christopher had been involved with analyzing on a commission that analyzed the 1965 Watts riots. At that time, so he asked Christopher to have a commission on police brutality and racism in the wake of the Rodney King beating. And they interviewed hundreds of police officers and community leaders and politicians and writers and police experts from around the country. And at the ACLU, my friends there were worried that he would whitewash the role of Daryl Gates because after the '65 riots, that's what that commission did. But Christopher had remorse about that, it turns out, and he wrote a very strong report that the ACLU could have written and created, and the headlines in the Washington Post, the same size as headlines when a president is elected or when war is declared, said Gates called on to resign by Christopher Commission. So it was a far-ranging coalition. It also included people like Michael Zinzin, a community activist who had been in the Black Panthers, and Richard Riordan, a conservative Republican businessman who would actually succeed Bradley for mayor. And that kind of center-left consensus was sufficient to thwart the entrenched power of kind of white grievance and the minority that always supported Gates.
And just take a little quick break and thank all the subscribers who are listening live and all the subscribers who listen when this goes out. And if you'll please consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Long View, I really appreciate it. Sustains conversations like the one I'm having with Danny. So thank you. So then the report comes out. You are working and the mayor is sustaining the coalition. This will end with Gates resigning and with structural reform, both of which are important. Can you talk about how each happens, and does Gates fight it until the very end?
Well, Gates fought it till the very end, and he thought he was going to win because he'd been involved with many controversies before where, the media and the ACLU and the black community were angry at him, and it blew over because the center of political governance in the city sided with him. His initial response was, "I'm not going anywhere." First, he said it was an aberration. Then he said, "I'm not going anywhere." Bradley's first thing was to have the police commission put him on paid leave. Bradley then challenged that in the city council and was able to prevail. Then Gates said that he would be informed by the Christopher Commission report, but when Christopher called for him to resign, he denied having said that and said that was just advisory and that, quote unquote, he wasn't going anywhere. He placed a lot of emphasis on the ballot initiative, which ended up taking place just about 6 weeks after the riots, which you may want to talk about for a minute. And he fought tooth and nail every step of the way. His strategy seems to have been, as long as he could keep delaying any change, public opinion would swing back towards him. Again, Bradley had been in office for 19 years and wasn't that popular. And people are scared of crime. And this was the height of the crack epidemic and gang warfare. And Gates constantly tried to say, hey, if you want to be safe, you need me. That he pointed himself as the indispensable man, kind of like when Donald Trump would say, only I can do it. That was pretty much what Gates was saying about crime. So the book, and why I did the book was I was kind of interested because I knew Scheinbaum, but I had a day job in the music business. I knew Ramona Ripston, who ran the ACLU. I was keenly interested, but I really didn't know the intricacies of how did they pull this off? How did they finally do it? I mean, bear in mind, after the George Floyd murder, congressional legislation to have modest reforms of police behavior failed. There were actually no reforms after the George Floyd murder politically, precisely because the interest faded onto other issues. So, yeah, he fought it tooth and nail. It took 16 months, and that's kind of what, although I tell some of the backstory, and I have a chapter saying what happened in the next couple of years, including the O.J. Simpson murder case, which involved some of the same people. But the center of the book is that 16 months, something that in a lot of parts of the community thought it should have taken 16 minutes for a change, but it took 16 months. And to me, it's a rare progressive/liberal success story. And the reason it succeeded is still relevant today, because although technology has changed and the political players have changed, the media has changed, the psychological balance between moral behavior of our public officials and fear of violent crime and the ability of demagogues to demonize people of other races is still at the center of our politics. And Bradley showed that a center-left coalition can overcome that. And that's what I wanted to kind of romanticize, because I felt these were heroic people. And I think they're good role models for some of our leaders today. The center and the left, when divided, are easily defeated by the right. When united, can prevail.
And an argument you make at the end of the book is that these coalitions need to focus on structure, not simply individuals. Unpack that, especially in the context of today, but certainly in the history you tell.
Well, in the history, it was a pretty clear thing. They needed to change the structure of city government if the police department was going to have any kind of accountability. Again, LA was an anomaly. Other cities already had some accountability. They had their share of problems. There are problems today. Race and crime, these are complicated, difficult issues. It's hard to be a police officer, and sometimes force is necessary, and sometimes people of goodwill can disagree about when force is necessary. But the LAPD under Daryl Gates was way off the charts in terms of the quantity of police killings, the virulence of the racial patterns, et cetera. And they needed to change the structure. They needed literally to pass a ballot initiative. So that was a very specific thing. I would say, though, in addition, the only way to actually accomplish structural change, you need brilliant administrators and lawyers and people who can work together and legislate and pass laws and win elections. But none of those things are possible without supermajorities of public support. And public support is generated by a communications ability and an organizing ability, not usually driven by lawyers, even though some of the people can do both. Ramona Ripston, who ran the ACLU in LA, was not a lawyer, but she was a high-profile public figure, unlike anyone in the ACLU today, who could move a public conversation and, most importantly, sustain a public conversation, because it takes months to get anything done, and the public attention, usually lasts 24 hours to anything. That's why they call it the 24-hour news cycle. So I think that the combination of clarity of goal, so it's not just vague slogans, but it's connected to specific, tangible change, married to coalition building, married to communications ability, is the cocktail that can make things better.
Well, this is a very important book. It's a pretty riveting read. It's an incredible history that you were part of, which I think gives it a special flavor, and it still resonates today. I think
Unfortunately.
many people will just see the attitude or the title, and in itself, I think that's a message many people are feeling. The book is Liberals with Attitude, the Rodney King beating, and the fight for the city of Los Angeles. This is Danny Goldberg. He's also worked with some of the great musicians, if you don't know, and then check that out. He mentioned Nirvana and today Steve Earle and many others. So, Danny, congratulations on the book. I urge everyone to read this, and we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Julian. Bye-bye.